Some objects weren't found by us, they found us. Most people believe that objects are passive, inanimate, simple property to be owned. We buy them, we collect them, we display them on our shelves, believing we have control over these material possessions. But here in Archive 7, we've learned a disturbing truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about ownership. Certain objects don't wait to be discovered. They orchestrate their own acquisition. My name is Mr. Keeper. Welcome to Archive 7. What I'm about to show you today will challenge your every understanding of how the world works. These aren't just mysterious objects with unusual properties. These are entities that manipulate events, influence human decisions, create what appear to be coincidences, but are actually carefully orchestrated campaigns that inevitably bring them exactly where they want to be. We didn't find them, they chose us. And once they choose you, you're no longer the owner. You become their instrument. Today I'll show you 3 objects from what we call the self-delivered collection. Artifacts that have demonstrated not just paranormal abilities, but actual intelligence, planning, and a disturbing level of control over human behavior. These objects have rewritten the rules of what it means to possess something. Because the terrifying truth is this: when an object chooses you, you don't own it, you serve it. Each of these objects arrived at Archive 7 through a chain of events that, when analyzed retrospectively, appears impossibly orchestrated. Sudden deaths that couldn't be predicted, unexpected inheritances that defied all logic, accidental discoveries that were anything but accidental. But behind each seemingly random occurrence was a pattern, design, a purpose that we're only now beginning to understand. Object 0489, the Collector's Watch. This ornate gold pocket watch, manufactured in Sheffield in 1889, belonged to Lord Edmund Ashworth, a Yorkshire nobleman whose passion for acquiring rare antiques would ultimately consume his entire family. But what Lord Ashworth didn't realize was that his most prized possession, this watch, was equally obsessed with expanding his collection, and it was willing to kill to do so. Lord Edmund Ashworth inherited his family's estate in 1888, along with a modest collection of approximately 800 antique pieces. By all accounts, he was a responsible collector, careful, methodical, never purchasing anything he couldn't afford. He kept meticulous records of every acquisition, every auction attended, every dealer contacted. His collection grew slowly and steadily, as any normal collection would. But in March of 1891, something extraordinary began happening. The pace of acquisition suddenly accelerated beyond anything that could be explained by normal means. Rare objects started appearing in Ashworth's possession through circumstances that became increasingly impossible to explain as mere coincidence. The first incident occurred on March 15, 1891. Ashworth's neighbor, a reclusive elderly man named Gerald Pemberton, was found dead in his cottage from what the local doctor determined was a sudden heart attack. Pemberton had lived alone for over 20 years, had no known friends or family, and had never spoken to Ashworth beyond the occasional polite greeting. Yet when his will was read, it contained a provision that left his entire collection of Roman coins, worth approximately £2,000, to my dear friend Edmund Ashworth, who has shown such keen interest in antiquities. Ashworth was baffled. He had never expressed any interest in Pemberton's collection. In fact, He had never even known Pemberton possessed such valuable artifacts. Yet there it was in black ink, in a will that had been witnessed and notarized just 3 days before Pemberton's death. The second incident followed just 2 months later. On June 3rd, 1891, a fire devastated Henderson's gallery on Bond Street in London, one of the most prestigious art dealers in the city. The fire burned with such intensity that virtually everything in the gallery was destroyed. Everything except one item, a 15th century Flemish painting that Ashworth had attempted to purchase the previous year but couldn't afford. The asking price had been £800, far beyond his budget. The gallery owner, Thomas Henderson, was ruined by the fire. His insurance covered only a fraction of his losses, and he was forced to sell his surviving inventory at drastically reduced prices. He contacted Ashworth directly, offering the painting for £60, less than 1/10 of its original price. Henderson explained that he remembered Ashworth's interest in the piece and wanted it to go to someone who would truly appreciate it. But here's what made it impossible. Henderson had never met Ashworth. Their only interaction had been through a letter of inquiry that Ashworth had sent months earlier. How Henderson remembered his name, let alone track down his address, was never explained. The third incident occurred on September 22nd, 1891, and it was the most impossible of all. A cargo ship called the Manchester Pride was transporting a collection of Egyptian artifacts from Alexandria to London when it encountered a sudden storm in the Thames estuary. The ship was driven onto the rocks and began sinking rapidly. Most of the cargo was lost, but one crate floated free. A crate containing a priceless statue of Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. Lord Ashworth happened to be visiting London that day. He happened to be walking along the Thames embankment at the precise moment the crate washed ashore. He happened to have a crowbar with him. He later claimed he had been using it to examine some architectural details of a nearby bridge. And he happened to recognize the hieroglyphic markings that identified the statue as genuine. But the survivors of the Manchester Pride reported something that chilled investigators to the bone. As the ship was sinking, as men were drowning in the cold waters of the Thames, they could hear something rising above the sound of the wind and waves. The distinct, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch, coming from the direction of the shore, coming from where Ashworth would later claim to have been coincidentally walking. Over the next 3 years, Ashworth collection more than doubled in size. Every acquisition followed the same pattern. Someone would die suddenly or suffer a catastrophic loss, creating an opportunity for Ashworth to acquire objects at a fraction of their value. A house fire that destroyed everything except one particular vase. A carriage accident that killed the collector just days after he had refused to sell Ashworth a Ming Dynasty bowl. A stroke that felled an art dealer immediately after Ashworth had expressed interest in a Renaissance sculpture. But every acquisition came with a price that Ashworth was only beginning to understand. The watch didn't just mark time, it manipulated it. It could accelerate diseases, orchestrate accidents, create the very tragedies that cleared the path for new acquisitions. In 3 years, Ashworth collection grew from 800 pieces to over 3,000. But 17 people died to make it happen. Lord Ashworth's personal diary, which we acquired along with the watch, reveals his growing awareness of what was happening. An entry from February 1894 reads, I begin to suspect that I am not acquiring these objects through fortune, but through design. Each death seems too convenient, too perfectly timed. I fear the watch is not simply measuring time, it is orchestrating it. His final entry, dated March 1st, 1894, is the most chilling of all. The watch has stopped. For the first time in 3 years, complete silence. No ticking, no movement of the hands. I understand now that I was never the collector. I was simply the curator. The watch has finished using me, and I fear my time has come. Lord Edmund Ashworth was found dead in his study the next morning, slumped over his desk, the pocket watch clutched in his hand. The cause of death was determined to be a sudden heart attack, though he was only 37 years old and had shown no signs of heart disease. The watch had stopped at exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds past 3 in the morning, the precise moment of his death. But here's what made it impossible. The watch had no second hand. It was a simple timepiece that marked only hours and minutes. It should have been mechanically impossible for it to stop at such a precise moment. Yet there it was, frozen at 3:03 and 33 seconds a.m., as if it had timed his death down to the very second. Object 0623, the Lancaster inheritance ring. This deceptively simple gold band, set with a blood-red ruby the size of a shilling, has been in the Lancaster family for over a century. But possession is entirely the wrong word to describe the relationship between this ring and the Lancaster bloodline. The ring doesn't belong to the family belongs to the ring. The ring has a characteristic that defies every natural law we understand. It never stays with the same person for more than 7 years. It moves automatically, without human intervention, to the family member who is most vulnerable, most desperate, most in need of the power it can provide. But that power comes at a cost that the Lancaster family has been paying for 4 generations. The first documented case occurred in 1923, when young Margaret Lancaster was dying of tuberculosis in a London sanatorium. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a middle-class merchant family, with no particular interest in jewelry or family heirlooms. She had been bedridden for 6 months, and her doctors had given her less than a week to live. Her family had gathered around her bedside to say their final goodbyes. On the night of October 13th, 1923, something impossible happened. Margaret woke to find a ring on her finger. No one had placed it there. No one in her family had ever seen it before. It simply appeared, as if it had materialized from thin air. The ruby seemed to pulse with its own inner light, warm against her fevered skin. Within hours, Margaret's condition began to improve. Her fever broke, her breathing eased, her appetite returned. Within a week, she was sitting up in bed, asking for books to read. Within a month, she had been discharged from the sanatorium, completely cured of a disease that had a 90% mortality rate. The doctors called it a miracle. The family called it divine intervention. But they should have paid closer attention to what happened to Margaret's brother, Thomas. Thomas Lancaster had been the picture of health, a robust 26-year-old man who had never been sick a day in his life. He worked as a clerk in a law firm, played rugby on weekends, had recently become engaged to a lovely young woman named Elizabeth. But exactly 7 days after Margaret's recovery, Thomas began coughing. Within a week, he was bedridden. Within a month, he was dead of the same tuberculosis that had nearly killed his sister. The ring had moved. Somehow, Impossibly, it had transferred from Margaret's finger to Thomas's without anyone noticing. And when Thomas died, it moved again, this time to his fiancée, Elizabeth, who had been devastated by his death and was contemplating taking her own life. Elizabeth's mental state improved dramatically while wearing the ring. Her grief lifted, her hope returned, her will to live was restored. But the improvement came at a price. Her elderly father, who had been supporting her financially after Thomas's death, suffered a sudden stroke and died within days. The ring had once again eliminated a problem by creating a bigger problem elsewhere. This became the pattern that would define the Lancaster family for the next century. The ring would solve one person's crisis by creating a fatal crisis for someone else. It fed on desperation, moving like a supernatural parasite from host to host, always ensuring there was enough suffering within the family to justify its continued existence. Dr. Margaret Lancaster, the tuberculosis survivor who went on to become one of London's first female physicians, kept detailed records of the ring's movements through her family. Her journals, which we acquired in 1987, reveal a pattern of behavior that suggests the ring possesses not just power, but actual intelligence. She writes, "The ring does not move randomly. It calculates. It evaluates each family member's needs, their vulnerabilities, their potential for desperation. It chooses its next host based on who can benefit most from its intervention, and who can cause the most interesting tragedy when that intervention requires a sacrifice." The ring spent 7 years with Elizabeth, during which time her finances stabilized and her health flourished. But when her cousin James lost his fortune in the stock market crash of 1929 and was contemplating suicide, the ring moved to him. James's business luck improved dramatically. He recovered his losses within months and became wealthier than he had ever been. But his wife, who had been the emotional support holding the family together during the financial crisis, died in what appeared to be an accidental fall down the stairs. When James's youngest daughter, Mary, contracted polio in 1934, the ring moved to her. She made a full recovery at a time when most polio victims died or remained permanently paralyzed. But her older brother Peter, who had been perfectly healthy, died in a car accident the same week Mary left the hospital. The pattern continued through 4 generations. Each time the ring moved, one person's life improved dramatically while another person's life ended tragically. The improvements were always genuine. The ring delivered exactly what its wearer needed most. But the cost was always the same. Someone close to them would die under circumstances that appeared accidental, but followed a timing that was far too convenient to be coincidental. What makes the ring particularly sinister is its apparent ability to create the very situations that justify its interventions. Family members would often report that their crises seemed to develop suddenly, out of nowhere, with a severity that didn't match the underlying circumstances. A minor business setback would rapidly spiral into complete financial ruin. A common cold would suddenly become life-threatening pneumonia. A minor family disagreement would escalate into a bitter feud that lasted for years. The ring didn't just respond to desperation, it cultivated it. It created the very problems it claimed to solve, ensuring that there would always be a family member desperate enough to accept its help, regardless of the cost to others. By 1987, The Lancaster family had been reduced to just 3 surviving members: elderly Dorothy Lancaster, her nephew Robert, and Robert's young daughter Susan. Dorothy had worn the ring for 7 years and had used its power to overcome a serious heart condition. But she knew that Robert was struggling with alcoholism and mounting debts, and she suspected the ring would soon move to him. In her final letter to our department, written just days before her death, Dorothy made a decision that no Lancaster family member had ever made before. She chose to break the cycle. "I will not let this ring destroy another generation," she wrote. "Whatever power it possesses, whatever intelligence guides it, I refuse to be complicit in its manipulation any longer." Dorothy Lancaster was found dead in her study 3 days later, the ring beside her on the desk. The official cause of death was the heart condition she had been fighting for years. But what was strange was the condition of the ring itself. For the first time in anyone's memory, the ruby had gone completely dark. It looked like nothing more than a piece of colored glass. Our agents acquired the ring along with Dorothy's journals and Robert's financial records. Robert Lancaster died of liver failure 6 months later, and his daughter Susan moved to Australia, cutting all ties with the family history. As far as we know, she never learned about the ring's existence. But the ring is not dead. 3 months ago, the ruby began to glow again. Faintly at first, then with increasing intensity. It's as if it's searching for something, or someone, and I can't help but wonder. What happens when an object like this can no longer find members of its original family? Does it simply choose a new family? Does it expand its definition of who qualifies as a Lancaster? Dr. Chen had a theory about the ring's true nature. She believed it wasn't actually helping people, it was farming them. Like a gardener who tends to plants not out of love, but to ensure a better harvest. The ring cultivated human suffering the way a farmer cultivates crops, always ensuring there was enough pain and desperation to feed whatever entity or force powered its abilities. 3 days before she disappeared, Dr. Chen made a discovery that terrified her. She found genealogical records showing that the Lancaster family wasn't the ring's first family. There had been others: the Whitneys in the 1800s, the Morgans before them, the Blackwoods before them. Each family had followed the same pattern: 4 generations of tragedy and intervention, ending with the family line either dying out or breaking away. And each time, the ring had simply found a new family to serve. What disturbed me most is this: how does the ring choose its families? What criteria does it use? And most importantly, how long has it been active in the world? And how many families has it destroyed? Object 0751. The Sterling Gallery Key. This ornate Victorian skeleton key, crafted from brass and iron with elaborate Gothic details carved into its head, belonged to Marcus Sterling, owner of the most exclusive art gallery in London during the 1880s. But this key didn't just open doors to rooms, it opened doors to survival. Impossible doors. Doors that shouldn't exist. And every time it saved Marcus Sterling's life, someone else died in his place. Marcus Sterling opened Sterling Gallery in 1888 with a loan from his wealthy uncle and a passion for bringing fine art to London's cultural elite. The gallery was located in a prestigious building on Bond Street, featuring 3 floors of carefully curated paintings, sculptures, and artifacts from across Europe. Sterling was ambitious, intelligent, and completely honest in his business dealings. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily unlucky. The first incident occurred just 6 months after the gallery opened, during a burglary attempt on the night of February 14th, 1889. 3 armed men had broken into the gallery, intent on stealing the most valuable pieces for resale on the black market. They cornered Sterling in his office on the 3rd floor, demanding he open the safe and show them where the most expensive items were stored. Sterling cooperated fully, hoping to minimize the damage and preserve his life. But the thieves were nervous, violent men with little patience for careful negotiation. When Sterling fumbled with the safe combination due to his trembling hands, the leader of the group struck him across the head with a pistol and declared their intention to kill him regardless of his cooperation. In desperation, Sterling grabbed the only object within reach, the ornate key that he used to lock the gallery's main entrance. As the thieves raised their weapons, Sterling backed toward what he knew was a solid wall. But when he pressed the key against the wall behind him, something impossible happened. A door appeared. Not opened, appeared, where there had been solid brick and plaster moments before. There was suddenly an arched doorway leading to a narrow passage that extended into darkness. Sterling fled through the impossible door, which sealed itself behind him the moment he passed through. The passage led him through what seemed to be the interior walls of neighboring buildings, emerging through another impossible door onto the street 3 blocks away. When he returned with the police an hour later, the thieves were gone, but the wall showed no sign of ever having contained a door. The police dismissed Sterling's account as the confused recollections of a man who had suffered a head injury. They theorized that he had escaped through a window and become disoriented during his flight. But Sterling knew what he had experienced, and more importantly, he still had the key. The next morning's newspapers carried a disturbing story. The 3 thieves who had broken into Sterling Gallery had been found dead in an alley 6 blocks away. They had died of what the coroner determined was sudden cardiac arrest. All 3 of them, simultaneously, in perfect health. There were no signs of violence, no indication of what might have caused 3 young, robust men to die of heart failure at exactly the same moment. But Sterling began to understand the price of his salvation when he learned more about the thieves' identities. They weren't career criminals. They were desperate men driven to crime by circumstances beyond their control. One was a father of 4 whose wife was dying of cancer and who couldn't afford medical treatment. Another was a veteran of the Afghan campaigns who had been injured and couldn't find work. The third was a young man whose family was facing eviction and starvation. The key hadn't just saved Sterling's life. It had eliminated 3 problems that might have generated sympathy for the thieves if they had been arrested and tried in court. It had ensured that Sterling's story would be one of heroic survival rather than tragic desperation. Over the next 5 years, the key saved Sterling's life dozens of times. London in the 1890s was a dangerous place for a man who dealt in valuable objects and carried large amounts of money. Sterling was robbed, threatened, attacked, and endangered with a frequency that seemed statistically impossible. But every time death appeared certain, the key would reveal an escape route that defied architectural logic. During a carriage accident, the key opened a door in the side of the carriage that led directly into a nearby building, allowing Sterling to escape seconds before the carriage plunged into the Thames. When a gas explosion destroyed half of Bond Street, the key revealed a passage through solid stone that led Sterling to safety, while 18 other people died in the blast. When a rival art dealer hired thugs to beat Sterling unconscious and steal his client list, the key opened a door in the floor of his office that led to the London sewers, providing an escape route that emerged 2 miles away. But with each rescue came a death. Not always the death of the people who threatened Sterling. Sometimes it was the death of completely innocent bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A chimney sweep who was working on a building that collapsed just as Sterling needed an escape route. A flower seller whose cart exploded in a gas main rupture that created the chaos Sterling needed to slip away from pursuers. A child who was struck by a runaway horse at precisely the moment when the horse's rider, who had been chasing Sterling, was thrown to the ground and killed. The pattern was always the same. The key would provide Sterling with exactly the escape he needed, but that escape would require a death to create the necessary circumstances. A door couldn't appear in a solid wall unless that wall was weakened by an explosion. A passage couldn't exist through a building unless that building's structural integrity was compromised by a fire. An escape route couldn't emerge in a crowded street unless that crowd was scattered by an accident. Sterling began keeping detailed records of these incidents, and the pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. The threats against his life weren't random. They were increasing in frequency and severity at a rate that suggested they were being orchestrated. Business rivals who had never shown hostility suddenly became violently aggressive. Customers who had been satisfied with their purchases returned, demanding refunds and threatening violence. Strangers began following him through London streets with increasing boldness. It was as if the key was creating the very dangers it claimed to protect him from. Sterling's journal entries from 1893 reveal his growing awareness of the trap he had fallen into. I begin to suspect that the key does not save me from misfortune, but rather creates misfortune from which it can save me. Each threat seems designed specifically to test the key's abilities. Each danger appears precisely when the key's intervention would be most dramatic. His final journal entry, dated October 13th, 1894, shows a man who had finally understood the true nature of his relationship with the key. I am not the key's owner. I am its instrument. It uses me to attract victims, then saves me so I can attract more. Every person who dies to facilitate my escape becomes fuel for whatever power animates this object. I am not surviving threats. I am bait. Marcus Sterling was found dead in his gallery the next morning, the key clutched in his hand. The door to the gallery was standing open, but the lock showed no signs of being forced or picked. The key had opened its last door, the door between life and death. And this time, it had chosen not to save the man who had served it so well. What makes the Sterling Gallery key particularly disturbing is what happened after Sterling's death. The gallery was sold to pay his debts, but the key disappeared from the estate inventory. For 3 years, it remained missing. Then, in 1897, reports began surfacing of a similar object being used by a different man in a different part of London. A bookshop owner named Henry Whitmore had begun experiencing the same pattern of escalating threats and impossible rescues. The key had found a new owner, or perhaps more accurately, it had found a new tool. Dr. Chen's research into the Sterling Gallery key revealed a pattern extending back much further than we had initially realized. She found records suggesting that similar objects had appeared throughout history, always following the same pattern. They would attach themselves to individuals who dealt in valuable objects or occupied positions where they might attract criminals or competitors. They would provide protection in exchange for creating a steady stream of deaths that appeared accidental or justified. What terrified Dr. Chen most was her discovery that these objects weren't working alone. She found evidence suggesting they were part of a larger network, a collection of artifacts that shared information and coordinated their activities. The key that saved Sterling might be the same key that had previously served a jewelry merchant in Paris, a rare book dealer in Rome, an artifact collector in Vienna. 3 days before her disappearance, Dr. Chen made a discovery that changed everything. She found shipping records showing that the Sterling Gallery key had been deliberately placed where Marcus Sterling would find it. It hadn't appeared in his gallery by accident. It had been delivered there by an antique dealer who claimed to have no memory of the transaction. Dr. Chen began to suspect that these objects didn't just find owners randomly. They were being distributed by someone or something with a specific purpose in mind. Someone was ensuring that the right objects reached the right people at the right times. Someone was orchestrating a network of supernatural manipulation that extended across Europe and possibly beyond. But who and why? And most importantly, what happens when this network has collected enough death, enough power, enough control to achieve whatever goal it's working toward? These 3 objects share a characteristic that defies everything we thought we understood about the relationship between humans and the material world. They don't serve their owners. They use them. They create elaborate situations that appear to benefit the human. But in reality, the human is just a tool in a larger design that we're only beginning to comprehend. What disturbs me most about the self-delivered collection is the intelligence these objects display. They don't act randomly or instinctively. They plan, they calculate, they manipulate human behavior with a sophistication that suggests they understand our psychology better than we understand it ourselves. They know exactly what buttons to push, what fears to exploit, what hopes to offer. Dr. Chen spent the last 2 years of her research developing a theory about these objects that, frankly, kept me awake at night. She believed they were part of a larger system, a network of connected entities working toward a common goal. The watch that manipulated time to expand collections, the ring that cultivated family desperation, the key that created the dangers it claimed to protect against. They weren't operating independently. They were coordinates in a larger pattern. But what was that pattern? What was the ultimate objective of this network? Dr. Chen's research suggested that these objects were collecting something. Not just causing deaths, but harvesting something from those deaths. Some form of energy, consciousness, or essence that powered whatever intelligence controlled them. 3 days ago, when Dr. Chen disappeared, she left behind a note that I initially dismissed as the product of exhaustion and paranoia. But the more I think about it, the more it terrifies me. The note contained just one line. We're not the guardians of these objects. We're their collection. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. If these objects can choose their owners, if they can manipulate events to ensure their acquisition, if they can coordinate their activities across continents and centuries, What does that say about Archive 7 itself? What if this entire facility, this whole operation, this network of government agencies that acquires and stores paranormal objects, what if none of it was our idea? What if Archive 7 didn't build itself to contain these objects? What if these objects built Archive 7 to contain us? Think about it. We acquire objects that demonstrate impossible abilities, and we bring them all to one secure location where they can communicate with each other. We study them, catalog them, expose ourselves to their influence on a daily basis. We've spent 70 years gathering the most powerful supernatural artifact from around the world and concentrating them in a facility that's completely isolated from outside oversight. If you were a network of intelligent supernatural entities seeking to maximize your power and influence, could you design a better system than Archive 7? Could you find a more efficient way to collect powerful artifacts, vulnerable humans, and complete secrecy in one convenient location? Dr. Chen's final research notes contain a timeline that shows the establishment of Archive 7 in 1952 corresponded exactly with a massive increase in the appearance of self-delivering objects around the world. As if the creation of the Archive had sent out some kind of signal that attracted these entities. Or as if the creation of the Archive had been the goal all along. I've been the primary keeper of Archive 7 for 12 years. I've dedicated my career to understanding and containing these objects. But I'm starting to suspect that our 12 years of service here haven't been employment. They've been captivity. We haven't been studying these objects, they've been studying us. And now that Dr. Chen has disappeared, now that the patterns are becoming clear, I can't shake the feeling that my time as an observer is coming to an end. That I'm about to transition from researcher to research subject. Next episode, I'll show you objects that don't just choose their owners or manipulate their circumstances. I'll show you objects that consume their owners entirely, body, mind, and soul. Objects that don't just use humans as tools, but as food. But I'm not sure how many more episodes I'll be able to record, because I'm starting to suspect that Archive 7 has chosen me for something specific. And based on what happened to Dr. Chen, based on what I've learned about these self-delivering objects, based on the way the facility itself seems to be watching me more closely each day, I don't think I'm going to like what it has planned. If you're watching this, if you're hearing my voice, remember this. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Some collections once started never stop growing. And some objects, once they choose you, never let you go. Welcome to Archive 7. Try not to let it keep you.